Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us again in our study of the story of the Bible, where we've been looking at the overarching story of the entire Bible. And what we're trying to do is by breaking it down into these 17 Bible time periods. And by the way, if you're watching these videos with us, we hope that you have a copy of that list of the 17 Bible time periods. If you don't have one, reach out to us. Jonathan or I, one will send you one, or you can just pause the video and write them down. And it would be a good idea maybe to try to put those to memory if you haven't already done that. And so we're breaking it down into these 17 different Bible time periods as we're seeing the Bible as one continuous story of redemption from beginning to end. My name is Ken Chapman. I'm an evangelist for the South Bumby Church in Orlando, Florida. And our co-host is Jonathan Caldwell, who's an evangelist for the Church of Christ in Moody, Alabama. Jonathan, how are you tonight?
Doing all right. I was waiting for that introduction. I thought you had forgotten about me.
Well, I would like to, but that's hard to do. No, if you watch these videos and you don't know Jonathan or I personally, you might get the feeling that we don't like each other. We like to poke fun at each other, but that's just because we do like each other and we've known each other for several years now. And so, and part of that friendship, really a large part of that friendship is just dogging each other and making fun of each other. But we enjoy our friendship, but we most importantly enjoy our camaraderie in the Word. And so, Jonathan, tonight our topic is going away. I don't know what happened there, but anyway, we're looking at, again, the 17 time periods, and we are in period number 6, the wandering of the wilderness. Now, if you're wondering about this list, Jonathan and I haven't come up with this list. We might have a little different list than this one. You might as well, but this one is so familiar to a lot of Bible students that we thought it'd be best just to stick with this one and use it as our guide. And so we've seen before the flood, the scattering of the people, the patriarchs, the exodus from Egypt, and now the wandering in the wilderness. One thing that we note about these time periods is dividing the Bible up this way. It's not an even division. It's not even when it comes to books of the Bible or sections of the Bible, and it's not even when it comes to time periods of the Bible. We have the scattering of the people, the third period, that's just one chapter in the Bible. We don't know exactly how much time would elapse in that chapter, but just one chapter of the Bible. And then we have this period number 6, the wandering in the wilderness, and it's going to take up the large portions of the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and maybe even a portion of Joshua, depending on where you make that line between period number 6 and period number 7.
And yet it was only 40 years.
Yeah, exactly. The Exodus, the patriarchs, larger time periods of time, but smaller chunks of the Bible. And so as the saying goes, it is what it is as far as the way it's divided up. But again, we're looking at period number 6, the wandering in the wilderness. It's a familiar time period to most people, most Bible students, if they studied that Bible timeline. But what I want us to remember tonight is, as we're looking at this, we're not just looking at each of these 17 time periods. We're wanting to see how these 17 time periods fit together. Remember, we're trying to emphasize that this is a continuous story throughout Scripture. We're getting from Genesis chapter 3, the introduction of sin into God's beautiful creation, and we're going to the cross. And so if we could draw a line, maybe an arc line from Genesis 3 to the cross, every other story in the Bible, every other character and event in the Bible needs to be on that arc somewhere. And we need to stop and ask ourselves, where does this event, where does this character, where does this time period fit on that line, that arc from Genesis 3 to the cross? And we're going to ask that about here in the wilderness, the wandering in the wilderness. But we have the patriarchs, of course, the promise that was made to Abraham, the patriarch of the patriarchs, and that was that through his seed, all nations of the earth would be blessed. But to get to that grand promise, we had also the land and the nation promise. God's going to use Abraham and his descendants and the nation that would grow out of him to fulfill, or one way to say that is to be the vehicle for these promises, because it is the Christ who will come out of that nation as a descendant of Abraham. And so we see that all of this has to do with that promise to Abraham that was introduced in Genesis 12, which is the beginning of God dealing with that sin problem that reared its ugly head in Genesis chapter 3. And so if we look at this period number 6, the wandering in the wilderness, we're just going to break it down kind of in the geography of it. In fact, at first I had a map on our PowerPoint here, but then I thought, no, we're just going to talk from city to city, because where it is on the map and as disputed as that map might be, is in some sense secondary to the story. And so I wanted us to focus more on the story. And so we go from Sinai. The first leg of the trip is from Egypt to Sinai. Remember, Jonathan led us in our discussion last week about the Exodus from Egypt. Moses, that grand deliverer who would deliver the people from their bondage. And so they've spent about 430 years in Egypt. And Moses, or God through the person of Moses, has now delivered them from that. And the text tells us that about 600,000 men, along with their families. Now, it's always an interesting discussion, isn't it, Jonathan, in Bible class, to kind of speculate as to how many people. If we've got 600,000 men and we add wives and children to that, Jonathan, what's a good round number that you would estimate left Egypt?
I think the number that usually comes up is about 2.5 million.
Yeah, I mean, if we just double 600,000, if we say there's a woman for every man,
right?
Again, that's just an estimate, that we're at 1.2, right?
Right.
And then if we add 2.5 children,
Yep.
In that day and time may have been more than 2.5 children. But I think a good safe number is about 200,000 or 2 million. Now, one thing to remember is that these weren't just the children of Israel. That's who we focus on through this Exodus and this wandering in the wilderness. But this would have been a mixed group of people, a mixed race group of people. Again, the bulk of them would have been the children of Israel, and that's really who we're interested in, because these are the people through whom God is going to bring the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham. But they leave Egypt, and now they're on their way to the famous location of Mount Sinai. Jonathan?
The important thing, people get very concerned about the numbers that are involved here. How could there have been that many people? But remember, it had to be enough people that it was causing the Pharaoh some consternation, that he was getting nervous seeing this amount of people continue to the population of this group to blow up. And so, we shouldn't be too surprised with this huge number of people, especially when you consider, 2.5 million people today. We see cities that house that many people. And so, yeah, it's a large enough group that it's causing Pharaoh some trouble. And then you see this large group just kind of wander out into the desert, under the guidance of a cloud, and get to Sinai, and then settle up around Sinai. Would have been a sight to behold, I think.
Yeah, and you think about 430 years prior to this, or the family of Abraham or of Jacob. There's again dispute about maybe where that timeline and what happens on that timeline, but a small number. And now, 400 years later, we've got maybe 2 million. One thing to think about is just go back in your mind, in your family tree, 400 years. To those ancestors, how many greats would that be? I don't know. Great grandmother and grandfather. And then from there, figure out how many descendants they have.
Right.
Not just in your family and your cousins, but we're talking about, your 54th cousin 17 times removed. There would be a large number in just your family, and your family is not the one that God had promised to bless in a special way, to multiply. And so certainly I don't think it's anything that should alarm us at all, that in 400 years, this family has grown exponentially with God's promise and God's blessing. But that number leaves Egypt. And you would think, wouldn't you, that now that they've left that burden in Egypt, the slavery, the hardship, and the mass genocide of their own people, that they would just be as happy, and there's nothing on this trip to complain about. But if you've ever taken a road trip with your family, that's being a little too optimistic. There's always going to be some complaints, and immediately those complaints rear their ugly head. It's centered generally around the hardship that they perceive that they're experiencing, lack of food, lack of appropriate drink, water at the times. But it just shows the lesson that their lack of faith in God, that the God that brought them out of Egypt, the God who brought the 10 plagues, the God who parted the Red Sea, I think he can provide you with something to eat and to drink along the way. Let's just pause and trust in him.
I'm thinking about, when our family comes down to see you, Ken, the kids load up their iPads with movies and get their headphones, and we get a big old box of snacks and that kind of a thing. And then, halfway there, somewhere around Macon, Georgia, maybe, the kids start complaining that they're bored and hungry and that kind of a thing. And Tiffany and I like to say, hey, you've never ridden to Tampa or Orlando in a van with, the scenery as your movie. So you can imagine that there is some issues going on here, especially as they are in the desert, as they do begin to get a little bit thirsty. But as they automatically assume the worst out of God, they are like little children. If the kids get a little bit hungry on a road trip, they assume that we're never going to feed them again. And the children of Israel here are like little children.
Yeah. And so they make their way down to Sinai. We know this famously, of course, is the place of the giving of the law, the making of a covenant with God's people. God makes a covenant with these new people. You could argue, if we look at that, what we usually think of as the three-pronged promise to Abraham, nation, land, and seed, you could argue that this is the birthplace of a nation. Is at Mount Sinai. You could also argue that they don't become a nation until they possess the land, and we could have that argument. But in some ways, you could say that they become a nation here, that they've got this codified law and this system and organization. So they cease to be slaves. They cease to be just a very, very extended family. And they really become a nation in a sense here at Mount Sinai as Moses delivers that law that he receives from God. And we could spend all of tonight and most of tomorrow talking about the events there at Mount Sinai. And you remember those well, their, again, continued rebellion against God. But God would give them that law. And remember, it's not just the 10 Commandments. We said earlier that we've got the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Just read the book of Leviticus if you think it's just 10 Commandments that we're dealing with here. I don't think Moses came down. Moses could not have carried the stone tablets that contained the whole of the book of Leviticus, of all the ordinances and the regulations regarding worship, the priesthood, and all of those things. But that's a part of this law. Pop quiz. How many laws were there according to Jewish divisions? 400, is that the number that comes to mind? Not quite. No. 613. Okay. 613. If you include the 10 Commandments, it's 613. Okay. Yeah. So that would have been a lot of stone tablets to contain all of that. And so the law is given, the covenant is made with these people. And again, an argument could be made that they become a nation. And so we can maybe check off one of the boxes of the promises made to Abraham. We could certainly check off the box that they had become innumerable, the great number of people from this one descendant of Abraham. And then from Sinai, they make the trip to Kadesh. Some scholars tell us that if they had wanted to, or if God had wanted them to, the journey from Egypt to Canaan would have taken somewhere between 6, 8, 10 months. Takes about 2 years the way God takes them here. So relatively short trip. And so they are in Kadesh. They're ready to receive the next box. In fact, you can just see Moses and the people. They've got their checklist on this trip. Nation, check. A great number of people, check. Land. And they got their pen poised over that check box to fill it in. We're about to get the land. And again, famously, we know the disappointment in the children of Israel for, again, a lack of faith and trusting in God. You remember the story where Moses sends the spies into the land to spy out the land. And part of their report was true. That is, hey, this is just like God, and maybe even better than what we imagined of what God had promised for us. But we just don't think we can take it. These are fortified cities. Remember, these people had been building bricks and pyramids and doing things like that. They had not been training to be a military force and might. And so, in a sense, even that estimation was correct. They could not have conquered these cities. I don't know that anybody would make the argument that they could have skillfully, through their military might, overthrown these cities. But as they had done on every leg of this journey, they had forgotten God. That God would provide for them, and God will fight their battles for them. And so, no, you can't conquer this land of Canaan. It is too big and too fortified for you, but God can. Jonathan?
Yeah, I would argue that their report about the land is completely true. You picture, has everybody colored that picture of the two guys holding the grapes?
The grapes the size of beach balls. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I think every kid has colored that in Bible class. The land flows with milk and honey, but also there are giants there. All of this is true, but God has just destroyed and dismantled Egypt and the Egyptian army. Why can't he do the same thing here with a much lesser group of people than Egypt? And so, their report is correct. Their conclusion about what they saw is incorrect, except, of course, in the eyes of Joshua and Caleb.
Absolutely. And they should have known what we probably can guess, and that is that the Egyptian army was probably a better army than any of the armies that they would have encountered in Canaan. And look what God did to them. Not what you did, but what God did. And so because of their lack of faith, their lack of trust in God, here at Kadesh, God makes the pronouncement to Moses and then to the people that, okay, you will not see the land. At least you who have made this decision will not see the land. And so the rest of this journey is it's a depressing journey. They're just going to wander around waiting for the last person to die. And so in our timeline here, I put from Kadesh to nowhere. Now, that's literally not the case, because they did go to places, and we know some of those places on the map, but it's not important where they went, because all's important in this is where they didn't go. They didn't go into the promised land. And so they're just wandering around. And you may have seen on some of the Bible maps that we just have a line just kind of like that of just wandering aimlessly around, just waiting for that generation to die.
I can't help but think about Deuteronomy chapter 1 at verse 2. It says, it is 11 days journey from Horeb by way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. 11 days they could have been from Mount Sinai into the promised land. And because of a lack of faith, it took them 40 years. And I think there's really some application there that, if we just go the way God tells us to, maybe we can be there in 11 days. We can have those blessings. We can have them even sooner. But when we look at it through our perspective, when we look at it through our worries and our frustrations and that kind of a thing, it winds up taking 40 years. Obviously, I'm mixing metaphors and whatnot here, but I love what Moses says. It was 11 days journey, and you turned it into 40 years. Thanks a lot, folks.
And in some sense, and your point's well taken, Jonathan, but in some sense, it was longer than 40 years. It's an eternity because they never made it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
That older generation, it wasn't 40 years. They never got to see that land. Of course, the younger generation will. And so again, what a depressing section of scripture. Let's just be honest about it, because their lack of faith, the older generation, will not see this land of promise. They won't check that box. They won't go from being slaves to being a nation in a land that flows with milk and honey. They'll never see that. All they're going to see is the sand of the wilderness and the dead bodies that fall. And it's depressing because we said this is just a journey of just walking around in circles, waiting for people to die. And so that older generation dies. Even Moses will not be able to enter into that promised land because of his sin that happened during this time period. And so we go from Egypt to Sinai, from Sinai to Kadesh, and then from Kadesh to nowhere, to the wanderings. And then we go from nowhere, the wandering, back to Canaan, or to the promised land. And so as Jonathan said, what could have taken 11 days from Horeb, taken probably about 2 years. The way God dealt with them has now taken these 40 years. Moses and that older generation is gone. And now a new leader, Joshua, has taken over the mantle of leadership. And they are standing again at a body of water that is separating them from the promise of God. How ironic that this journey began at a body of water and God having to help them across it. And now it's ending 40 years later at another body of water, waiting with anticipation. Imagine 40 years of anticipation, really more than 40, about 400 plus years of anticipation for when this promise was given to Abraham to be able to enter into this land of promise. Now, remember, how does this fit into the story of getting us from Genesis 3, the sin problem, to the cross, the solution to the sin problem? Well, it's all tied up in those promises to the patriarch Abraham and using this nation of people. The New Testament, the Apostle Paul talks about the old law, the old covenant being a schoolmaster who would bring us to Jesus. And so it brings us to Jesus, yes, through the messianic prophecies, but it also brings us to Jesus through the sacrifices that are going to be offered, the law that's going to be given, the constant reminder of this sin problem that needs a solution. And all of those things are bringing us to that cross. Maybe slowly, but this is the path, this is the time schedule that God has chosen, that man needed to be able to see the need for the solution that was going to be found in that final and grand promise to Abraham, that through your seed, all nations of the earth would be blessed. And so here they are at the precipice again of this promised land. And Lord willing, next time we're going to look at that seventh time period, the invasion and the conquest. We're going to cross that other body of water and journey into this promised land, finally, that was promised to Abraham, to his children, and to Moses. Well, we thank you for joining us tonight in our study of the story of the Bible. We hope that you can join us next Monday night at 6:30, where again, we will look at time period number 7, the invasion and the conquest of Canaan. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, Jonathan, for your help tonight, and we will see you next Monday evening.